Hi, Dr. Fox here. The purpose of this video is to discuss a little tricky phrase called null hypothesis. Oftentimes teachers get in research classes and come across this concept of null hypothesis statistical testing, and it just is a little bit mind-boggling. So I want to try to make it a little bit simpler by using an example. A typical teacher heard that using restorative practices could really help create a better classroom climate. So this teacher is, decides to use restorative practices. She looks into it and she decides to measure her class on classroom climate by using a classroom climate questionnaire. And what she finds out is that the average of the class on classroom climate is 34.5. Sounds like an arbitrary number, but in any case, she begins using restorative practices, and after that first semester, she decides to see if the intervention is actually working. So the teacher retests the class, and this time the average is 41.2. So the teacher decided, okay, I guess the restorative practices worked. But the question is, can the teacher definitively conclude that the difference in classroom climate was really due to restorative practices? 34.5, it increased to 41.2. Was there a difference? And this scenario is very typical for teachers who want to try out a new strategy, some pedagogical strategy or some behavioral strategy in their classrooms. And okay, it's kind of limited, but we can see that in this case it may have made a difference. However, let's set up a little bit different scenario. There was another teacher who just had a class on using research practices in school settings. And let's see how this teacher set up the study. Okay, so this master teacher decided to use null hypothesis statistical testing. This teacher had two different classrooms that really could be used for this study. So we're going to name them Classroom A and Classroom B. Classroom A is going to be the control group, and it's not going to receive any restorative practices by the teacher. In contrast, Classroom B is going to be the experimental group, and they're going to receive restorative practices intervention for a full semester. But before beginning the study, the teacher gives both of the classes the classroom climate questionnaire. And Classroom A's average was 34.5. Classroom B's average was 34.9. Essentially, the difference is just due to chance, and that's chance. Chance is really the only plausible explanation at this time of the difference between Classroom A and Classroom B. They're essentially the same. So the teacher decides to set up the null hypothesis statistical testing, and for this you have to have a null hypothesis. And then you also have to have an experimental hypothesis. So here is the null hypothesis. There is no statistically significant difference between Classroom A and Classroom B on classroom climate. That's the null hypothesis. But the alternative hypothesis is that there is a statistically significant difference between Classroom A and Classroom B on classroom climate. Now, let's just take a little break here. What exactly is the null hypothesis? It sets up for us what really is the status quo. That's what we have here, status quo. It's a statement of equality. It's symbolized by H and then a small zero, alt. Not, or null, so null hypothesis. And essentially there is no statistically significant difference between, or if you're looking at some other type of study, there's no statistically significant relationship. But for this study, there is no statistically significant difference. Again, this is status quo. We haven't done the study yet, so we don't know if restorative practices is really going to make a difference. In addition, it's impossible for us to say, even after we do the study, that we can prove that restorative practices really made the difference in classroom climate. So we can't say we have absolute proof. But what we can say is we can state the null hypothesis, and after the study, we could potentially say, because of the evidence, we're going to reject that null hypothesis. By rejecting the null hypothesis, we're basically saying the null hypothesis is there is no difference, but we're going to reject that because of the evidence and say there is a difference. We can't prove that the difference is based upon the restorative practices, but we can reject the null hypothesis that says there is no difference. We can reject that. There might be other reasons for the differences that we might see after using restorative practices, and we can't control for all of those. So that's essentially why we use a null hypothesis. Now, in contrast, the hypothesis is it's also referred to as the alternative hypothesis. Some people refer to it as the experimental hypothesis, and that's why you see the H with a little a there. The little a subscript is alternative. So this is an alternative hypothesis, and we're basically saying that there is a statistically significant difference. And what we're looking for is a p-value. That's what we calculate when we do statistical testing. We calculate a p-value to see if it's less than, for social science, we use 0.05. So let's jump back into our study. The study continues. The teacher uses restorative practices with the experimental group, remember that's classroom B, for a full semester. And at the end of the semester, the teacher uses the same classroom climate questionnaire on both classrooms. This time, classroom A, which is the control group that had no restorative practices, had an average of 34.2. Okay, that's about the same as what it was in the beginning. Classroom B, however, who was the experimental group with the restorative practices, had a mean of 43.6. Higher. And there is a difference there. But do we know if there really is a statistically significant difference? So for this, we have to use a particular type of statistical test. And we've chosen this one because it was two groups of the same people. So this is referred to as a paired samples t-test. And we calculated the p-value, and it was determined that the p-value was 0.032. It's below 0.05. So what do we do when it's less than 0.05? We can reject the null hypothesis. Remember, the null hypothesis said there is no difference. It was a statement of equality, essentially. There is no difference, and we're rejecting that. We're saying that there is a statistically significant difference between the classroom climate of classroom A and classroom B. However, now because there was statistical significance, we also have to determine the effect size to see how big that difference really is. But in the meantime, maybe for another video, in the meantime, we can be fairly certain, the teacher can be fairly certain that restorative practices can actually make a difference in the classroom climate. So the teacher begins using restorative practices with both classes now. I hope this was helpful to you in understanding a little bit more about null hypothesis statistical testing. Blessings.